We now come to Robert Nozick's argument against any patterned or end result principle of distributive justice. This is going to include Rawls's principle of distributive justice, the difference principle. This is going to be Nozick's argument against a Rawlsian conception of justice, or at least of distributive justice. And though Nozick doesn't call it, everybody calls it the Wilt-Chamberlain argument because this person, Wilt Chamberlain, figures in the argument. Nozick uses him as an example to illustrate the argument. Here's how the argument works. You start with whatever principle of justice principle of distributive justice that you like. Any patterned or end result principle of justice. You pick your favorite one. And so the way the argument works is it's going to work against any patterned or end result principle of distributive justice. So whichever one you think is the best, whichever one you think works, whichever one you think is true, start with that one. And what you're going to do is you're going to start with a society that accords with your principle, right? So for the sake of illustration, I'm going to use strict equality, right? You might think that distributive justice requires everybody having totally equal wealth and income. Okay, totally equal wealth. That's D1, right? Let's say that's your favored principle of distributive justice. You start with a distribution that follows it. That's D1. Now, what Nozick asks us to, let me introduce a little bit something here. Why is it called the Wilt-Chamberlain argument? It's because at this point, Nozick brings in this guy, Wilt Chamberlain. And so for the purpose of illustrating, we're going to treat 1, 2, 3, and 4 as people, as each 4 different people. And the fourth person is going to be Wilt Chamberlain. So Wilt Chamberlain was a very famous basketball player back in like the 60s. He's like the best basketball player in the NBA. I don't know how it worked exactly. I don't really know much about the NBA, about basketball, about Wilt Chamberlain, but he was really good. And Nozick uses him in his argument. All right, so 1, that's me. 2 is that guy with the head. And 3 is the worker fella. And 4 is Wilt Chamberlain. And so we're imagining a society where we all have equal amounts of money, right? We all have the same amount of money. So there it is. We all have a stack of bills the same size. Okay, fine. But now, let's say me and the other first 2 guys are really big fans of basketball, and we really like seeing Wilt Chamberlain play. And so we pay him money. You know, actual going to see a basketball game is more complicated than this, but just simplify it for the sake of the illustration. We pay him money to watch him play basketball, right? So I really like seeing Wilt Chamberlain play. And so I'm happy to pay him, to give him money so that I can watch him play, right? I'm happy to transfer some of my money to Wilt Chamberlain, right? I willingly do it. He's not manipulating me. I'm not coerced. I want to do it, right? And so I transfer my money to him. I pay for his services, so to speak. I pay to watch him play basketball. And say the other 2 people too, number 2 and number 3, are likewise fans of basketball and fans of Wilt Chamberlain. And so we start off in D1 where we all have equal money, but then through just transfers of money, we're going to arrive at a different distribution, which Nozick's going to call D2. So I'm going to give my money to Wilt so I can watch him play basketball. And the number 2 fella is going to do the same. And the number 3 fella is going to do the same. And so now we have all willingly and freely given our money to Wilt Chamberlain, and we've gotten to watch the basketball game, and we thought that was a good deal. I'd do that again or whatever, right? But now if you look at the money, the stacks of money down there, we have a different distribution of wealth. We have D2, where me and the other 2 guys have half as much money as we had. We gave them half our money, right? Those expensive basketball tickets. And Wilt has a whole bunch of money, right? So we start with D1, which accords with your principle of distributive justice, your pattern, whether it's strict equality or maximin or something else, right? Maximin being Rawls's thing. And then through just transfers of money, we wind up with a different distribution of wealth. Something like that happens all the time. This is a very simplified example, but this is what happens in society, Nozick would say, right? People freely transfer their money in exchange for goods and services, right? And 1, 2, and 3, me and those other 2 guys, we freely exchanged our money for the benefit of watching him play basketball. And then he did that and we were happy, right? Well, so what's the problem here? D2 does not accord with the pattern, right? We started, so the idea is D1 is supposed to accord with the pattern of distributive justice that we think is true. Distributive justice requires that everyone be given equal wealth. But through just transfers of money, we wind up with D2, which doesn't fit that pattern. Wealth is not equally distributed, right? And so if we thought that strict equality was what justice required, we'd have to say D1 was just. But if we thought strict equality was what justice required, we'd have to say that D2 is unjust, right? Because it's not, wealth isn't equally distributed there. The problem is, if D1 was just, and if it was converted to D2 through just transfers, right? Wilt didn't steal our money. We weren't manipulated into giving him our money, right? We did it freely, right? Just transfers. So if D1 was just and it was converted to D2 through just transfers of money, D2 could not possibly be unjust. Where did the injustice creep in? How did it creep in? If we start with something that's just and then just apply more just actions to it, just transfers in this case, how could we wind up with an unjust result? That makes absolutely no sense. There was no injustice committed by anybody. Nobody violated any of the principles of justice. And we started with a completely just distribution by your own lights, right? You who put forward a pattern theory of distributive justice. And since we can do this with any patterned principle of distributive justice is going to run into this problem. And so I think what Nozick would say is that if you have a principle of justice that's going to imply that D2 is unjust, that principle of justice is false because it's impossible for D2 to be unjust. If D1 was just, which it is by your own lights, right? You who put forward strict equality or maximin, or whatever it might be. And if D2 came out of D1 through just transfers, where did the injustice creep in? It didn't, right? D2 has to be just as well, right? That's Nozick's idea. But anybody who puts forward a pattern theory can't say that because D2 very clearly doesn't follow the pattern or the end result, if you want to put it in those terms, right? And so this argument could be run against any patterned end result theory of distributive justice. Let's try Rawls's, right? So I did it with strict equality. Let's try Rawls. There's your equality line, right? If resources are distributed equally, you'll hit that line. So let's start with a distribution that satisfies Rawls's principle of distributive justice, the difference principle, right? How does it satisfy Rawls's principle? Well, look at the least advantaged group. In this case, that's 1. Are they doing better than they otherwise would if we distributed things equally? Is the inequality to their benefit? Well, yes, it is. They're up above that line. There we go. D1 follows maximin or Rawls's difference principle, however exactly you want to put it, right? So D1, Rawls would say, yeah, that's a just distribution. That follows my principle of distributive justice. Wilt Chamberain. Robert Nozick would just run the same exact argument. All right, fine. We start with D1. And now let's imagine it's all the same people. 1, 2, and 3 are those three guys. I'm number 1, and 2 and 3 are the other guys. And then 4 is Wilt Chamberlain. And say we continue to be Wilt Chamberlain fans, and so freely transfer some of our money to him to watch him play basketball. And so we lose some money because we freely transferred it to Wilt, right? And so our money goes down and Wilt's goes way up, right? Because he's the recipient of that money. Rawls would be committed to saying, the difference principle is committed to saying that D2 is unjust. Nozick's idea is that that's crazy. That's impossible. How could D2 possibly be unjust? If D1 was a just distribution, which you, Rawls, want to say it was, right? And if we get to D2 by free exchanges of money, free just transfers of money, which we're supposing we do, right? How could D2 possibly be unjust? It couldn't. That's Nozick's argument, right? And so this is going to be Nozick's reason for thinking that not only Rawls is wrong, this would be his reason for thinking the difference principle is wrong. But not only that Rawls was wrong, but that any patterned end result principle of distributive justice is wrong. He could supply the same kind of argument against any patterned end result principle of distributive justice. And so what he would take that to show, the only kind of principle of distributive justice that's going to escape this argument are going to be historical, non-patterned theories of distributive justice. What Nozick would say is that, let's say D1 right there is just. Let's say everybody in D1, the holdings that they now possess, they are entitled to. And then through just transfers of money, we come to D2, right? Everyone pays Wilt to watch him play basketball. Well, according to the entitlement theory, and according to the entitlement principle of distributive justice, D2 is just as well, right? Because everybody's entitled to their holdings in D2. And so Nozick would want to say both D1 and Nozick's principle of distributive justice would imply that both D1 and D2 are just. Or, to put it actually a little bit more precisely, if D1 was just, well, then D2 would be as well, because D2 arises through just transfers of money. And so if everyone's entitled to their holdings in D1, everyone would be entitled to them in D2. And so, yeah, it's perfectly just, according to Nozick. And only historical, non-patterned principles will get you that result. As soon as you put forward an end result or pattern principle, your principle, your theory, is going to run into the Wilt Chamberlain argument to this problem, according to Nozick.